Imagine this. A man who never made it past the rank of corporal in World War I now sits in a massive war room, staring at maps, lecturing men who've spent their entire lives mastering the art of warfare. That man is Adolf Hitler. And with every genius decision he made, Germany moved one step closer to disaster. The story of Hitler's micromanagement isn't just about arrogance. It's about what happens when ego replaces expertise and power blinds judgment. At the height of his success in the early years of World War II, Hitler started to believe his own myth. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war strategy, had crushed Poland, France, and much of Europe in record time. The victories came so fast that even his own generals began to believe he had some kind of natural strategic brilliance. To Hitler, this was proof that he, not the German high command, was the real military mastermind behind the victories. But this illusion was built on a misunderstanding. Those early victories weren't the result of Hitler's genius. They were the product of professional officers, years of preparation, and advanced tactical innovation. Hitler simply took the credit. The reality was that Hitler's military background was limited and shallow. During World War I, he served bravely as a messenger on the Western Front, but he never held a command role. He had no formal training in large-scale strategy, logistics, or battlefield coordination. Yet by the late 1930s, he was surrounding himself with generals and dictating operations down to the smallest detailed troop movements, supply routes, and even the timing of attacks. The higher his confidence grew, the less he listened to those who actually knew what they were doing. His contempt for the professional military class had deep roots. Hitler saw the old Prussian officer corps, men like Guderian, Manstein, and Rommel, as relics of an outdated world. They came from aristocratic families, educated in elite military academies, and many viewed him, the former corporal, as an outsider who didn't belong among them. This class tension fueled his mistrust. He believed they were loyal to Germany, but not necessarily to him or his ideology. That paranoia shaped his leadership. Every disagreement became a personal insult. Every warning was treated as disloyalty. This mindset led to one of the most dangerous leadership styles in history: centralized micromanagement. Hitler didn't just set goals or broad strategies. He wanted total control over how every battle was fought. He made orders based on ideology, not logic. He would decide, from hundreds of miles away, how individual divisions should move, often ignoring reports from the front lines. His obsession with controlling everything strangled the flexibility of the German army, which had once been famous for its ability to adapt and improvise. In the early years, this control seemed to work. Hitler's bold, risky decisions paid off because his enemies were still unprepared. His invasion of France in 1940, for example, shocked the world. He ignored cautious generals and pushed for a daring plan through the Ardennes, a move that broke the French lines in days. That success confirmed his belief that instinct was better than experience. But it also set a deadly precedent. Whenever his generals disagreed, he reminded them that he'd been right before. By 1941, Hitler's ego had become untouchable. After a string of victories, he began to call himself a military genius. His generals were now just instruments of his will. Field commanders were expected to obey, not think. The more power he gained, the smaller the circle of people who could challenge him became. Dissent wasn't just discouraged, it was punished. Many officers learned that arguing with Hitler could end their careers, or worse, so they stopped arguing. They followed his orders even when they knew those orders were suicidal. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, revealed how dangerous this approach had become. At first, the campaign moved swiftly. The Wehrmacht captured vast territories and millions of Soviet prisoners. But when his generals urged him to concentrate on Moscow, Hitler refused. He was convinced he knew better. He diverted forces south toward Ukraine, chasing resources instead of strategy. That delay cost him the chance to capture the Soviet capital before winter, a mistake that doomed the campaign. The generals knew it was wrong. They had argued for months against splitting the army. But Hitler's word was final. Micromanagement soon turned into outright interference. Hitler began issuing no-retreat orders, forbidding commanders from pulling back even when their positions were hopeless. His logic was ideological, not tactical. He believed that standing ground was a test of will, not a matter of survival. The result was catastrophic. Entire divisions were surrounded and annihilated because they weren't allowed to retreat. Cities like Stalingrad became death traps because Hitler refused to let go of a symbolic victory. Generals like Guderian and Manstein, some of the brightest military minds of the era, were repeatedly sidelined, dismissed, or ignored. They would plan counterattacks or withdrawals that made tactical sense, only for Hitler to override them with emotional decisions made from his headquarters hundreds of miles away. Guderian once wrote that trying to reason with Hitler about strategy was like arguing with a brick wall. Every time the army suffered a defeat, Hitler blamed his subordinates instead of his own interference. Even worse, his micromanagement created fear at every level of command. Officers became hesitant to act without explicit orders, even in emergencies. The hallmark of the German army initiative and quick decision-making disappeared. The rigid chain of command turned the Wehrmacht from an agile, adaptable force into a slow, fearful machine. Commanders who once prided themselves on tactical freedom now waited for approval from Berlin before making a move, even when lives depended on it. As the war turned against Germany, Hitler's behavior grew more erratic. He spent hours poring over maps, moving pins and lines, as if the war could be won on paper. He dismissed reports that contradicted his expectations, calling them lies or defeatism. He increasingly relied on intuition instead of intelligence reports. His headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, became an echo chamber where only loyalists were allowed to speak. Those who dared to contradict him, like Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, were replaced by men more willing to obey without question. This obsessive control also poisoned relationships among his officers. Many generals began hiding bad news, fearing Hitler's rage if he learned the truth. False optimism became standard. Reports from the front were tailored to sound better than they were. The result was a widening gap between reality and what Hitler believed. When things began to fall apart on the Eastern Front, he couldn't see it coming because everyone around him was too afraid to tell him. Hitler's need to control everything extended, even to the smallest details. During the Battle of Kursk in 1943, he postponed the offensive multiple times, obsessing over technical adjustments to new tanks instead of focusing on timing. By the time he finally gave the order, the Soviets had fortified their defenses and prepared counterattacks. The result was a disastrous loss of tanks and men that Germany could never replace. The generals who had warned him about the delays were ignored once again. By this point, Hitler's delusion of being a military genius was complete. He saw himself as a modern Frederick the Great or Napoleon. In reality, he was making the same mistakes those leaders had made in their final years, believing his intuition outweighed experience, rejecting advice, and waging wars he couldn't win. His interference didn't just cause bad decisions. It destroyed the confidence and initiative of the German military system itself. It's easy to think of Hitler as an evil dictator, which he absolutely was. But what's often overlooked is how his personality directly influenced the course of the war. His insecurities, his need for control, and his obsession with being seen as the smartest man in the room turned Germany's most powerful weapon, its army, into its greatest liability. So, when we talk about the failures of Nazi Germany, it's not just about bad luck or overwhelming odds. It's about how one man's ego unraveled an entire military machine. Hitler didn't lose the war because his enemies were better at first. He lost because he couldn't trust anyone but himself. This is Dumb Historian, where we dig into the world's worst decisions and the chaos they left behind. If you're enjoying the series, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because the deeper we go into these stories, the dumber the history gets. The no-retreat order was one of the most disastrous examples of Hitler's growing obsession. With control and his delusional belief that willpower could overcome reality, in his mind, holding ground was not just a tactical choice, it was a test of ideological purity. He believed that any order to withdraw was an act of weakness, a betrayal of his vision of absolute victory. This thinking reached its most catastrophic expression on the Eastern Front, where he forbade his generals from conducting even the most basic tactical retreats. The result was the destruction of entire armies, the loss of irreplaceable men and equipment, and the collapse of any remaining trust between Hitler and his military leadership. The clearest example of this madness was at Stalingrad in 1942. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had fought its way deep into the city. It was one of the most brutal battles in history, street to street, room to room, and basement to basement fighting. The city itself was reduced to rubble. Hitler's obsession with capturing Stalingrad wasn't about military strategy, it was about symbolism. The city carried Stalin's name, and Hitler wanted to destroy it to send a message. But as the Red Army encircled the Germans in November 1942, trapping them inside the ruins of the city, every experienced commander could see the situation for what it was: death trap. The logical decision was to pull back and regroup before the encirclement closed completely. Paulus requested permission to break out several times. Hitler refused. Hitler's voice, transmitted through the headquarters network, was unyielding. The Sixth Army will stand fast, not a step back. To him, retreat meant weakness. He believed that if his troops simply held their positions, the Soviets would exhaust themselves and collapse. He promised that supplies would be flown in and reinforcements would arrive to break the encirclement. None of that was realistic. The Luftwaffe was already overstretched, and the promised airlift could not deliver even a fraction of the food, ammunition, and fuel required to sustain an army of over 250,000 men. The result was catastrophic. The encircled Sixth Army was cut off from all supply lines. As the winter deepened, food ran out. Soldiers ate horses, dogs, and even boiled leather. Ammunition dwindled. Frostbite and starvation began killing men faster than Soviet shells. Paulus and his generals sent repeated messages to Berlin, warning that without permission to retreat or break out, the army would be destroyed. Hitler's response was always the same: hold your ground. Stalingrad must be held at all costs. By January 1943, the situation had become unbearable. The troops were dying by the thousands every day. The wounded froze to death in makeshift hospitals without medicine or heat. The remaining soldiers were reduced to fighting with rifles that wouldn't T-fire in the cold and grenades that misfired. Many units were down to a fraction of their original strength. Hitler, sitting safely in his East Prussian headquarters, refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. He believed the Sixth Army would somehow stand firm and turn the tide through sheer willpower. It's important to understand that Hitler's no retreat order didn't come from military logic, it came from his personal worldview. He saw war as a test of faith and character, not as a series of tactical problems to be solved. He demanded that his soldiers fight to the last bullet, the last man, even when it made no sense. He believed that spirit and fanaticism could overcome tanks, artillery, and logistics. He often told his generals, courage is worth more than ammunition. This kind of thinking might have inspired fanatical loyalty in a speech, but on the battlefield, it was suicide. The destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad was one of the worst defeats in German military history. Over 90,000 men surrendered to the Soviets. Only about 5,000 of them would ever return home after the war. An entire army had been wiped off the map because one man refused to allow a retreat. Even worse, this was not an isolated incident. It became a pattern. Hitler applied the same stand-fast orders at Demyansk, Urzev, Kharkov, and countless other fronts. Whenever his generals tried to conduct a strategic withdrawal to shorten their lines or preserve their forces, he accused them of cowardice or defeatism. At Urzev, for example, German troops were ordered to hold exposed positions deep inside Soviet territory through the winter of 1942-43. Soviet offensives surrounded and battered them for months. Thousands died in the snow, trapped in a position that had no strategic value. At Demyansk, an entire pocket of German troops was surrounded, and instead of ordering a breakout, Hitler insisted on an air supply operation that barely kept them alive. Though some of these encircled troops managed to hold out, the cost in men and materiel was immense. These victories were illusions, Pyrrhic triumphs that drained the German army's strength. As the war dragged on, Hitler's interference became even more extreme. He micromanaged the movement of individual divisions and battalions from his headquarters, hundreds of miles away, often ignoring the realities reported by his field commanders. He distrusted his generals, believing that they lacked faith in his vision. When Field Marshal Guderian, one of Germany's most brilliant armored commanders, argued for flexible defense and tactical withdrawals, Hitler shouted him down. He once told Guderian, "You know nothing about the spirit of the German soldier. He does not retreat." That belief became a death sentence for tens of thousands. By refusing to allow retreats, Hitler destroyed the very flexibility that had made the Wehrmacht so effective during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. The success of the German army in 1939 and 1940 came from speed, maneuver, and adaptability. Commanders at the front had the freedom to make quick, tactical decisions based on changing circumstances. Hitler stripped them of that freedom. Every decision now required his personal approval, which came too late or not at all. The Wehrmacht transformed from a mobile, creative force into a rigid machine chained to the delusions of one man. The psychological impact on the soldiers was devastating. They no longer fought with the confidence that their commanders would make rational decisions to protect them. They knew that even if a position became hopeless, they would be ordered to stay and die there. This knowledge crushed morale. Desperate units often fought to the last man, not out of loyalty, but because they knew surrender was their only other option. Many officers disobeyed orders in secret, conducting small-scale retreats or evacuations without informing Berlin, risking execution for insubordination. By late 1943 and 1944, Hitler's no-retreat doctrine had become a symbol of the regime's insanity. On the Western Front, after the Allied invasion of Normandy, he issued the same kind of order to his forces in France. The result was predictable encirclement and destruction. Entire armored divisions were trapped in the Falaise pocket because they were forbidden to withdraw. In the east, the same pattern repeated itself in Belarus during Operation Bagration, when the Red Army annihilated Army Group Center, killing or capturing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Again, the cause was the same. Hitler refused to allow any withdrawal. Even his closest commanders began to see the truth. Field Marshal Manstein, who had once been one of Hitler's favorites, called the no-retreat policy suicidal. He tried repeatedly to argue that strategic withdrawals could save Germany's fighting strength, allowing for counteroffensives later. Hitler dismissed him, claiming, "We cannot give up ground. Every meter of land is sacred." To Hitler, territory mattered more than troops. But wars are not won by land alone, they are won by the men who hold it, and those men were dying needlessly because of his arrogance. In the end, Hitler-esque no-retreat orders turned the Eastern Front into a graveyard for the German army. It wasn't just about military failure, it was about the complete collapse of logic under ideology. The generals knew when to pull back, regroup, and fight another day. But Hitler's obsession with never yielding made that impossible. He believed he was teaching the world a lesson in strength and resolve. What he actually taught was how one man's pride could destroy an empire. At Stalingrad, the soldiers of the Sixth Army froze and starved in the ruins of a city they could have escaped. Across Russia, division after division was sacrificed in the name of an illusion. The no-retreat order wasn't just a military blunder, it was a statement of madness. It turned the art of war into a death sentence. And by the time Hitler realized it, there were no armies left to save. Hitler's obsession with terrain was not strategy, it was vanity, disguised as vision. He saw maps not as tools for planning, but as symbols of domination. His fixation on capturing names and landmarks, instead of focusing on destroying enemy armies, turned the war into a collection of ego-driven crusades. He would point to a city on the map, often for ideological or emotional reasons, and decide that this was the next great target. To him, owning a city meant victory. But to his generals, it meant disaster. Every time Hitler picked a symbolic location over a strategic one, it drained his army of strength, men, and time, the three things he could least afford to lose. One of the clearest examples of this obsession was Stalingrad. It wasn't just another Soviet city, it was Stalin's city. The name alone seemed to challenge Hitler personally. To him, conquering Stalingrad wasn't about cutting off Soviet supply lines or securing the Volga. It was about humiliating his enemy. He wanted to prove that Germany could take a city bearing his rival's name. But that decision ignored every warning from his generals. Commanders like von Manstein and Paulus urged caution. They wanted to focus on destroying the Red Army's fighting power in the open, not getting bogged down in brutal street-to-street fighting. Hitler didn't listen. He overruled them all. In his mind, the propaganda value of capturing Stalingrad outweighed the practical reality of holding it. He told his generals that once Stalingrad fell, the Soviet Union's morale would collapse. Instead, the exact opposite happened. The city became a fortress. The Red Army turned every factory and apartment block into a stronghold. German tanks, built for open warfare, were trapped in narrow streets and ambushed from basements. Supplies ran low. Reinforcements couldn't reach the front fast enough. Yet Hitler refused to retreat. He personally ordered his troops to fight to the last man, even as they starved and froze. This wasn't an isolated mistake, it was part of a larger pattern. Hitler repeatedly valued land over lives, prestige over practicality. He viewed every battle like a chessboard, but one where he cared more about keeping his favorite squares than winning the game. He would move entire panzer divisions mid-campaign to chase after some symbolic goal without regard for logistics or terrain. The results were predictable. Fuel shortages, broken supply lines, and exhausted troops stranded far from support. The generals who protested were dismissed as cowards or traitors. His obsession wasn't limited to Stalingrad. The Caucasus campaign in 1942 showed the same warped priorities. Hitler became fixated on capturing the oil fields around Baku. His reasoning was entirely irrational. Oil was vital for the German war machine, but the way he pursued it revealed his flaws. Instead of maintaining focus on the main front, he split his forces, sending one group toward the Caucasus and another toward Stalingrad. It was a logistical nightmare. The Wehrmacht's supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across harsh terrain. With little infrastructure, trucks broke down, fuel convoys were attacked, and men collapsed from exhaustion. Generals begged him to reconsider, warning that the army was overextended. But Hitler didn't want advice. He wanted obedience. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he micromanaged every movement. He issued direct orders about which divisions should advance, where they should halt, and when they should attack. These commands often ignored the realities on the ground, whether supply issues or enemy resistance. The commanders in the field knew the situation better, but they couldn't disobey. They followed orders that made no sense, not because they believed in them, but because they had no choice. To Hitler, controlling these details gave him a sense of mastery. He would stare at the map for hours, tracing lines with his finger, moving pins as if victory could be arranged from his desk. He was surrounded by officers too afraid to contradict him, so no one dared to point out that his plans were physically impossible. He wanted everything Stalingrad, the oil fields, the Caucasus Mountains, and refused to choose between them. This all-or-nothing mindset spread his army thin and guaranteed failure. In contrast, his generals were trained to think about flexibility, the ability to adapt plans when conditions changed. They valued mobility, concentration of force, and timing. But Hitler dismissed these principles as weak or old-fashioned. He replaced them with ideological slogans about willpower and destiny. He told his soldiers that faith would overcome cold and hunger, that fanaticism would substitute for fuel. The soldiers on the ground paid the price for those delusions. At Stalingrad, those delusions reached their breaking point. When winter set in and the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, the German Sixth Army was encircled. The generals begged for permission to break out, but Hitler refused. He ordered them to hold their ground, promising that supplies would be flown in. The Luftwaffe couldn't possibly deliver enough to sustain the army, but he wouldn't accept reality. His obsession with holding that symbolic city outweighed every logical consideration. Even when Field Marshal Paulus finally surrendered, Hitler refused to believe it. He ranted that his soldiers should have fought to the death. To him, the loss of Stalingrad wasn't just a military defeat, it was a personal insult. But it was an insult he created himself. He had turned a strategic campaign into an ideological crusade. His fixation on terrain had destroyed one of Germany's best armies and shattered the myth of invincibility he had built. This pattern repeated itself again and again. When he ordered the defense of every inch of ground in Russia, it wasn't because it made sense militarily, it was because retreat, in his eyes, meant weakness. He told his generals that Germany had to fight to the last bullet. But that kind of thinking turned every battle into a bloodbath. When Rommel, in North Africa, tried to pull back his forces to avoid encirclement, Hitler overruled him too. Rommel knew the situation. He could see the British closing in, but Hitler, sitting thousands of miles away, insisted on holding the line. The result was predictable. Rommel's army was crushed. Hitler's obsession with terrain also had psychological roots. He saw conquest as validation proof that his destiny was real. He viewed cities and regions like trophies that confirmed his greatness. This mindset led him to undervalue the one thing that truly mattered in war, the army itself. Destroying enemy forces should have been his goal, not collecting symbolic places on a map. But to Hitler, losing land, even strategically useless land, was unbearable. His pride couldn't handle the idea of retreat, even when it was the smartest choice. The irony is that his enemies learned from his mistakes. The Soviets under Stalin often sacrificed territory to preserve their army, trading land for time. They understood that the war would be won by endurance, not maps. Hitler never grasped that. He believed he could will the war to victory through sheer determination, that capturing key cities would somehow force surrender, but every time he took land, he lost something far more valuable: soldiers, resources, and momentum. By 1943, his obsession had transformed the Wehrmacht from a highly mobile, adaptable force into a rigid, reactive one. The generals who once led with initiative now waited for orders from a man who didn't understand their circumstances. Every decision came slower. Every plan became less coordinated. The German army was no longer fighting with skill. It was fighting with stubbornness. Hitler's terrain obsession wasn't just a flaw. It was the embodiment of his leadership style. He saw war as theater, where symbolism mattered more than substance. But in the real world, cities don't win wars, armies do. And when those armies are wasted chasing vanity projects, the war is already lost. This is Dumb Historian, where we uncover the most absurd decisions that shaped history's greatest disasters. If you're enjoying the breakdown, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because history only gets dumber from here. By the middle years of World War II, Hitler's grip on the German military machine had become absolute, but with that control came destruction from within. As defeats mounted on every front, his faith in professional soldiers evaporated. The very men who had built the early German victories through tactical brilliance and hard-earned experience were now seen as enemies of his vision. Hitler had started the war surrounded by some of the most capable military minds in Europe, commanders like Erich von Manstein, Heinz Guderian, and Erwin Rommel. But as the war turned against him, he replaced these strategists with loyal yes-men, political officers, and ideologically driven commanders whose main qualification was obedience, not competence. This purge of professional military minds ensured that his blunders would no longer be challenged, questioned, or corrected. At the heart of this downfall was Hitler's paranoia. He believed that disobedience was treason and that criticism was sabotage. In his mind, every general who questioned his orders was secretly plotting against him. This paranoia grew after the catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. When Operation Barbarossa failed to bring the quick victory he had promised, Hitler began to blame his generals rather than his own unrealistic plans. He accused them of lacking the willpower and fanaticism needed to carry out his vision. But these generals were not cowards. They were realists. They understood that Germany was facing an industrial and numerical giant in the Soviet Union. They could see that the logistics were breaking down, that fuel and ammunition were running out, and that the troops were exhausted. Hitler refused to hear any of it. Erich von Manstein, for example, was one of the most gifted strategic thinkers in modern warfare. He had masterminded the surprise attack through the Ardennes that crushed France in 1940. Later, he led brilliant counteroffensives in the Soviet Union, saving entire armies from destruction through flexible maneuvering. But Manstein's genius came with independence. He believed in mobile warfare and tactical withdrawal when necessary, ideas that clashed with Hitler's rigid, stand-fast doctrine. When Manstein tried to argue that the Eastern Front could only be stabilized through controlled retreats, Hitler exploded in anger. To him, even suggesting withdrawal was defeatism. In March 1944, after months of friction, Hitler dismissed Manstein outright. The Reich had lost one of its last capable commanders, replaced by officers who would nod, salute, and execute any order, no matter how suicidal. Heinz Guderian suffered the same fate, known as the father of Blitzkrieg. Guderian had revolutionized modern warfare through his emphasis on fast, armored assaults, and coordination between tanks and aircraft. His tactics had brought Germany lightning victories in Poland and France. But by 1941 and 1942, Guderian saw the cracks forming. He warned Hitler that the invasion of the Soviet Union was overstretched, that supply lines were collapsing, and that the army needed time to regroup. Hitler ignored every warning. Their confrontations became heated. Guderian was known for his bluntness. He didn't flatter, and he didn't soften his criticism. In Hitler's court, that was a death sentence. By 1941, Guderian was relieved of his command for insubordination. He was later recalled briefly, but only in a diminished role. His brilliance was wasted because the Führer could not tolerate dissent. Erwin Rommel's story followed a similar pattern, but it revealed something even darker about the regime. Rommel was one of Hitler's early favorites, a field commander who inspired both his men and the German public. His daring campaigns in North Africa earned him the nickname the Desert Fox. But even Rommel's loyalty had limits. By 1944, after seeing the hopelessness of the war and the destruction Hitler's orders were causing, Rommel joined the growing circle of officers who believed Germany needed to negotiate peace. When the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler failed, Rommel's name was linked to the conspirators. Though his actual involvement was uncertain, the Nazi leadership saw an opportunity to eliminate another independent thinker. He was given a choice: commit suicide quietly or face a public trial that would destroy his family. Rommel took the cyanide pill. With his death, one more professional soldier was erased from the chain of command. The purge went beyond removing individuals. It destroyed an entire culture of professional military thought that had defined the German army for generations. Before Hitler's rise, the German General Staff had been one of the most respected institutions in the world. It trained officers in logistics, operational art, and strategy. These men were not political. They were soldiers who lived by discipline, planning, and analysis. Hitler saw that professionalism as a threat. He wanted fanatics, not thinkers. He replaced the merit-based system with a political one, where loyalty to him mattered more than competence. Officers who praised his decisions were promoted. Those who questioned them disappeared, transferred, sidelined, or worse. This transformation had devastating effects on the battlefield. As the war entered its later years, Germany's command structure was paralyzed by fear and obedience. Orders from the top were absolute, even when they made no sense. For example, when Hitler demanded that divisions hold positions against overwhelming Soviet forces, no one dared to argue. When he ordered counterattacks with no fuel or reinforcements, his generals executed them, knowing they were sending their men to die. In the past, commanders might have adjusted orders on the spot based on real battlefield conditions. By 1944, that flexibility was gone. The German army no longer acted as a thinking organism. It was a rigid machine controlled by one man, as delusions. The contrast between the early and late war periods was striking. In 1939 and 1940, the Wehrmacht's success came from delegation. Junior officers were trusted to make rapid decisions, adapting to changing circumstances. This decentralized command style, known as off-track tactic, allowed for lightning-fast operations. But by 1943 and 1944, Hitler had replaced it with total micromanagement. Orders were detailed down to the last movement, and no one dared to alter them. The creative spark that had made blitzkrieg effective was gone. In its place stood a culture of obedience where survival meant silence. One of the most tragic consequences of this purge was that capable generals often saw disaster coming, but were powerless to stop it. Before the Battle of Kursk in 1943, for instance, many commanders warned Hitler that the Soviets had heavily fortified their positions and that the element of surprise was gone. They advised postponing or canceling the attack. Hitler ignored them. He launched the offensive anyway, and it ended in catastrophe. Thousands of tanks were lost, and the Wehrmacht never regained the initiative on the Eastern Front. The generals knew this would happen, but Hitler's inner circle, filled with men like Keitel and Jodl, who existed only to agree with him, silenced dissenting voices. Wilhelm Keitel is the perfect symbol of this decline. As head of the OKW, the High Command of the Armed Forces, he was supposed to act as a bridge between Hitler and the professional military. Instead, he became a mouthpiece. Officers mockingly called him Lakitel, a play on words meaning the lackey. He approved every decision, no matter how irrational, and never challenged the Führer. His presence reassured Hitler that his authority was absolute. But in reality, it meant that Hitler was isolated in an echo chamber where only his opinions existed. The result was predictable. As the Allies closed in from both east and west, Germany's strategic decisions became detached from reality. Hitler issued orders to armies that no longer existed, demanded counterattacks from divisions that had been wiped out, and blamed his generals for betrayal whenever his impossible commands failed. The officers who might have saved Germany from total destruction had already been dismissed, dead, or too afraid to speak. By purging the professional mind from his military, Hitler ensured that his own incompetence would go unchecked. He created an environment where truth was treason and obedience was the only virtue. Every failure became self-reinforcing. The fewer professionals remained, the worse the decisions became. The worse the decisions became, the more Hitler blamed treachery instead of himself. It was a spiral that ended in ruin. When Berlin finally fell in 1945, the last remnants of the Wehrmacht were being commanded not by strategists, but by loyalist men. The once proud German army, known for its precision and professionalism, had been hollowed out by ideology and fear. What had started as a disciplined military force was reduced to a cult of obedience. In the end, the purging of Germany's best military minds was not just a personnel mistake, it was the collapse of strategic thought itself. Hitler had turned his army into a mirror of his own mind, paranoid, inflexible, and doomed to self-destruction. Every voice that could have changed the course of the war had been silenced, leaving one voice to command the ruin of millions. By the final years of World War II, Adolf Hitler's war machine was no longer a symbol of precision or dominance. It was a reflection of his collapsing mind. The same man who once boasted of reshaping Europe with iron will had turned his army into a crippled instrument of his ego. His refusal to hand over control to experienced generals, his obsession with absolute command, and his paranoia toward even his most loyal officers turned what could have been a fighting chance into an inevitable catastrophe. Germany's defeat was indeed just caused by overwhelming Allied strength. It was caused by a dictator who couldn't stop interfering. Hitler's micromanagement went far beyond poor decisions on maps. It infected every layer of command. He insisted that no general could make a move without his personal approval. This meant that frontline commanders who saw the situation unfold in real time had to wait for permission. From someone sitting hundreds of miles away in a bunker, orders were delayed, responses were sluggish, and initiative disappeared. The German army had once been famous for its doctrine of off-track tactic mission. Command where officers were encouraged to make quick decisions based on the battlefield's realities. Under Hitler, that culture was destroyed. Instead of flexible leadership, the Wehrmacht became a machine locked to his whims. By 1944, his paranoia had grown to the point where he no longer trusted any of his top officers. Men like Guderian, Rommel, and Manstein, brilliant tacticians who had helped build Germany's early victories, were sidelined, dismissed, or forced into silence. When they offered advice, he took it as criticism. When they suggested retreat or regrouping, he accused them of defeatism. Every disagreement became an act of betrayal. The army was no longer led by professionals. It was held hostage by one man's delusion of genius. Inside the Wolf's Lair, his Eastern Front headquarters, Hitler's war conferences became theater. Generals would bring in situation reports, but they quickly learned that truth was unwelcome. If the news was bad, Hitler exploded in rage. He slammed fists on the table, accused his officers of incompetence, and delivered rants about destiny and betrayal. Maps were spread out across the table, and he would move flags and markers as if he could will divisions into existence. The generals who disagreed were quietly replaced with loyalists, men who would obey rather than argue. This loyalty came at a cost. When the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the German command structure was paralyzed. Field marshals like Rommel knew that the invasion was coming, and they had begged Hitler for permission to keep panzer divisions closer to the coast for a rapid counterattack. But Hitler refused. He insisted the Allies might attack at Calais instead, and kept key armored units on standby, waiting for his personal orders. When the invasion began, he was asleep. His staff, terrified of waking him, delayed action until it was too late. By the time the panzers were finally deployed, the Allies had secured the beaches. That hesitation born of fear and micromanagement cost Germany any chance of throwing the invasion back into the sea. The same paralysis occurred on the Eastern Front when Soviet forces launched massive offensives. German commanders repeatedly requested tactical withdrawals to preserve their forces. Hitler's response was always the same: not one step back. He had issued this command so many times that it became meaningless, a death sentence disguised as bravery. Units were ordered to hold ground until they were encircled and annihilated. Instead of falling back to defensible positions, they died in place. The turning point came in 1944 with Operation Begression, the Soviet assault that wiped out Germany's Army Group Center. Hitler refused to believe his intelligence reports. He thought the main Soviet thrust was still headed for Ukraine, not Belarus. He ignored the warnings of his generals and kept his forces spread too thin. When the offensive began, the Red Army crushed the German lines within days. Entire divisions were wiped out, hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed or captured. Hitler blamed everyone but himself. He accused his generals of cowardice, of lacking faith, of sabotaging his plans. But the truth was simple. His leadership had broken the army's ability to function. His obsession with control even extended to technology. Germany had some of the most advanced weapons of the warjet fighters. Rockets, heavy tanks, but Hitler constantly interfered in their production and deployment. He insisted on designing tanks that were heavier, slower, and over-engineered, like the Tiger II, which broke down more than it fought. He demanded new wonder weapons that could turn the tide, but his unrealistic expectations only wasted resources. He ignored his engineers' warnings that mass-producing reliable weapons was more important than chasing perfection. As a result, the army often had superior prototypes, but too few of them to matter. By late 1944, Hitler had turned from commander to dictator, in denial. The Allies were bombing German cities daily, the Eastern Front was collapsing, and his generals knew the war was lost. Yet he refused to accept it. He claimed that Germany's defeat would only come if the people themselves were unworthy of him. In a final act of delusion, he issued the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure bridges, factories, railways, so that nothing useful would fall into Allied hands. Even his most loyal minister, Albert Speer, ignored that order, realizing that it would condemn millions of civilians to starvation and ruin. The final months of the war were a grim reflection of Hitler's leadership. In Berlin, surrounded by Soviet artillery, he still issued commands to imaginary armies that no longer existed. He promoted officers to lead divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier. He talked about counterattacks that would never come. The once feared Führer had become a man detached from reality, trapped in a bunker, still trying to control a war that had already passed him by. His downfall was the logical end of his rule. A leader who could not trust, could not delegate, and could not learn was doomed to fail. His micromanagement, once seen as evidence of dedication, became evidence of madness. The very army that had conquered Europe in 1939 was, by 1945, shattered, not just by enemy fire, but by the suffocating grip of its own leader. When Hitler finally took his own life, the German High Command didn't just lose its dictatorate, it was released from a nightmare. The story of Hitler's micromanagement is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a warning. It shows how absolute power and absolute ego destroy even the most capable systems. The Wehrmacht wasn't beaten only by superior numbers or firepower, it was beaten from within, paralyzed by one man's arrogance. Every time Hitler overrode a general, every time he delayed a decision, every time he refused to retreat, he carved another line in Germany's obituary. History often remembers him as a tyrant, defined by ideology and cruelty. But his incompetence as a commander deserves equal attention. He turned war into theater and strategy into superstition. He ignored logic, replaced expertise with loyalty, and mistook stubbornness for strength. The result was millions of deaths, a ruined nation, and a legacy of failure disguised as destiny. In the end, Hitler's defeat wasn't just military, it was moral and psychological. His need to control everything revealed his deepest weakness, fear. He feared being wrong, being questioned, being human. And in that fear, he destroyed the very army that once gave him power. This was the downfall of a dictator who thought he could outthink the generals, outplan the strategists, and outfight the world. But history proved that even the most feared man in Europe couldn't conquer his own arrogance. You've been watching Dumb Historian, where we dive into the biggest blunders that changed the course of history. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because sometimes the dumbest decisions make the most unforgettable history.